Hello and welcome to the first episode of an Enclave-themed playthrough of Fallout New Vegas, during which we'll be assuming the role of William Purge, also known as Will Purge, on his mission to restore law and order to the west coast of the United States. So obviously this is going to be a roleplay or a light roleplay playthrough of Fallout New Vegas, during which we'll be trying to play as if we are playing, or we are, some sort of special operative from the Enclave sent by either President Autumn or President Eden or Augustus Autumn from the West Coast, or maybe the Capital Wasteland or Chicago. Doesn't really matter when it comes to the specifics. And we'll be trying to find out what's going on the West Coast. Because in Fallout 3, obviously, Augustus Autumn, as well as President Eden, presumably learned that Navarro was destroyed, and they didn't have this information previously. And obviously we'll be trying to figure out what happened here, trying to possibly establish some sort of connection between the East Coast and the West Coast Enclave sort of presence. And that's basically the gist of it. That's basically the backstory. And obviously William Purge, during his travels, because he had to travel by foot, obviously any sort of vertebrate would have been shot down by either the NCR or the Brotherhood of Steel during his long trip from one coast to the next. He traveled on foot, and during this period of time he picked up a job as a courier. And, well, afterwards he picked up the platinum chip and got shot in the head twice by Benny. Now that's all fine and dandy, but due to that, obviously our special operative here doesn't really remember much. He doesn't remember if he was sent by either President Eden or Augustus Autumn. He doesn't really remember the specifics. All he has to go on is his sort of field orders, or the orders that were issued to him when he left Chicago, let's say. And those are, first, try and establish some sort of connection or some sort of Enclave presence within the area, and possibly find any Enclave remnants in the Mojave Wasteland. The second mission, or the second objective, I suppose, would be to try and infiltrate what remains or whatever is there of the Brotherhood of Steel, possibly try and disrupt their operations and maybe even destroy them, however that is highly optional. The last, or the third objective, would be to eliminate any sort of genetic and ideological undesirables. So from those objectives, it might be President Eden, it might be Augustus Autumn, because genetic and ideological opposition or undesirable presence within the Mojave would be eliminated either under the command of one or the other. So we don't know exactly who is leading us. And as well as the fourth and final objective is to get revenge on the bastard who shot me twice in the head. Obviously that's sort of a given. However, that being the final objective, the fourth one, we don't exactly really need to pursue that. So for the time being, we'll be trying to find out any sort of remaining Enclave presence, and those will be our objectives until modified by any sort of other Enclave officer / general / whatever official presence that we try and find here. Now obviously within the roleplay, that's the story, but when it comes to actual gameplay, I tried to mod in quite a lot of weapons and quite a lot of armors to sort of suit this role-playing need. So for starters, William Purge here will be wearing modded in Enclave experimental armor, which is a combat armor that has roughly 16 to 17, not entirely sure, combat threshold, or damage threshold more rather, and is quite OP for the early game. As well as I'm using the Elysium AK mod, because I think it fits in nicely with the sort of theme of finding scavenging items on his long walk from one coast to another, not really being able to maintain all of his plasma / laser / whatever energy weaponry, and having to modify sort of more rudimentary weaponry with the technology that he was being provided. And for that reason, I decided to tag the guns skill, the energy weapons skill, and the repair skill to sort of represent this this attempt by our main character here to sort of survive in the wasteland by scavenging various items. The second weapon I'm going to be holding is just the Gun Brothers Arsenal plasma pistol, which is a fitting theme. Maybe William Purge prefers plasma pistols as opposed to laser pistols, because in Fallout 3 we do find that the Enclave usually uses either one of those, so it's sort of a give and take. However, within the lore of the game, I do think that it being categorized as the same skill is a little bit strange, because obviously not all guns are the same. However, within the lore, let's say that William Purge is okay with using laser pistols or laser weaponry. However, he does prefer plasma weaponry. That's why he took a plasma pistol as his secondary weapon to his long trek across the United States. Brilliant. Now that's all the mods for William Purge here when it comes to weapons and equipment. On the other hand, I did also mod in the 2 perks per level mod or whatever, because he obviously is a special operative and he is a trained veteran of the Enclave armed forces. Thus he was sent alone, obviously, otherwise he wouldn't be sent alone if he wasn't equipped to deal with all the dangers that lie ahead of him. And for that reason he is skilled and he's somehow really good at combat, and thus 2 perks per level does make sense. To sort of mitigate this incredible overpoweredness that I gave my character, I tried to make various, let's say, appeasements to the general Mojave wasteland. I did mod in quite a lot of ghouls into the overall wasteland, so wherever there are ghouls, there should be more of them, and there also should be various ghouls just stationed around the Mojave wasteland in general, as I think you could have already seen. Right beneath, or right down from Good Springs down the road, there was a pack of ghouls that we cleared out quite nicely. So that's going to bring a whole bunch of challenges. In addition to that, I did download a mod that overhauls the raiders, gives them better equipment, gives them a different equipment from their vanilla set, so that should be at least an interesting challenge, as well as placing them in various places that they weren't before, as well as upping their numbers by quite a substantial margin, I have to say, even to the point of them spawning right inside of Good Springs. However, I did cut that out because that was a little bit strange. So that's the overall picture we're looking at here when it comes to mods. Apart from the sort of equipment and weapon mods, which there are a lot of weapon mods because I'm sort of a person that really enjoys a lot of weapon mods, a lot of variety when it comes to the gameplay, a lot of variety provided with weapons and guns and armor. Not so much of a graphics and sort of a visual enhancement person. Don't really care for that, as well as I just generally like how Fallout New Vegas looks, just, you know, in vanilla. I'm not really too much of a graphics person myself. I'm a much more of a gameplay variety person, so there we go. On top of that, I also downloaded a whole bunch of Enclave themed mods. And so obviously for the Enclave, an Enclave radio station, which I can't really play right now because it's probably copyrighted. However, there probably will be some sort of music throughout all of these episodes in the background that sort of captures the theme of the Enclave quite nicely, and basically the Enclave radio sort of simulates that in the actual gameplay. And apart from that, I also modded in a whole bunch of new wildlife, which should be a little bit more dangerous, because it sort of scales with the level, also places it in various new places, again, that these animals weren't really present during the vanilla game. So this sort of compilation of mods, which I hopefully will remember to put in the description below, should really shake up the way that this campaign or this playthrough is going to go, and give us a much better feel for sort of the path that William Purge here is going to have to take when it comes to dealing with all the dangers and trying to restore order, and again trying to follow those main objectives that he has been given. Because other than these objectives, we obviously have to take into account the overall ideology of the Enclave when dealing with some sort of a role-playing segment or role-playing playthrough when it comes to simulating an Enclave playthrough again. So, the ideology of the Enclave is quite curious. I think it's one of my favorite factions when it comes to Fallout in general. Not because I necessarily agree with them 100%, but I think that they have a very interesting backstory, more so than, for example, the Brotherhood of Steel or the NCR. The Enclave obviously is basically the old government and the old United States military, everything like that. The old way is very much present within the Enclave, and the old ideology of, let's say, America from the 1950s to 60s as present in basically all of Fallout, and more specifically, of course, the America present in Fallout before the bombs fell, which is a very, let's say, aggressive nation. I wouldn't really categorize it as fascist because the ideology, it doesn't really match up with fascism. However, from an ideological perspective, we'll be trying to preserve regular citizens, regular Americans. We'll be trying to protect them, spread law and order by any means necessary. We've been sort of, sent here to do that. So that's what we'll be trying to do. And as sort of simulated here in this little Good Springs standoff, we'll be trying to also defend regular Americans from just bad people, just criminals. That's the ideological opposition. Again, at least a little bit of an ideological opposition right there. So it's even in the name, Good Springs is good, and the Power Gangers are bad because they have gang in the name. So there we go. But yeah, that's the general gist of it. We'll be trying to preserve whatever remnants of the old way of America there are, and from the variety of mods that I've actually played that sort of simulate playing as the Enclave, whether it be in Fallout New Vegas or Fallout 4, the sort of preservation of the American way seems to be always present, and that's sort of their ideology even in Enclave sort of I guess not recordings, but in Enclave sort of dialogue from Fallout 3. And to a certain extent Fallout 2, however, in Fallout 2 and Fallout 3 they were extremely sort of one-dimensional, more so in Fallout 3 obviously. I think they were very poorly handled in Fallout 3, and it's a very big part of the reason why I sort of wanted to do this role-playing playthrough, I suppose a role-playing campaign, as an Enclave soldier, because I think they were misrepresented in a majority of the Fallout games, because when you actually take a look at the core ideology, it's not actually all that terrible. It's trying to sort of do away with the terrible damage basically the atomic war has dealt to the general population of America and Americans in general, trying to restore the old world in its more pure form, and basically disregarding any sort of potential damage or potential danger that this could bring to some sort of cohesive structure of the populace in general. So basically ghouls, they were American citizens, however now they're not because they're mutated and they live in an ungodly long time. Thus they pose a potential danger because a variety of reasons. Obviously there's a variety of reasons why ghouls wouldn't be able to be accepted by any sort of sane government, because well, for one, they are basically a source of an unlimited workforce. You could pay them less but pay them continually. You have basically a source of an unending labor, which is very bad for the economy in general. So maybe the Enclave was onto something there. However, their actions might have been immoral. Their actions in general are sane, because having basically an undying labor force is terrible for not just the wasteland, because basically you could, again, as I explained before, terrible labor force, economy in tatters, even if you're trying to rebuild it. On top of that, you have the fact that they look like mutating corpses, and on top of that, you add that they are probably going to go feral at some point. So it's generally, ghouls are terrible. Super mutants, again, extremely poorly portrayed in the Bethesda series. They were attempted to be a little bit better portrayed in Fallout New Vegas, however, they still come across as a little bit deranged, and even in Jacob's Town, we do see that a majority of them are a little bit deranged. In Fallout 1, the super mutants were actually sort of at least a little bit better off when it comes to intelligence. However, that obviously didn't work out too well. And again, it's basically a labor force that is extremely powerful, can do a huge amount of manual work due to their strength, and I think they're immortal, or at least extremely resilient when it comes to aging. So there we go. I try to explain that in a sort of a cohesive manner, at least a little bit, but I think when you look at it this way, it does certainly make the Enclave look a little bit better when it comes to their goals of just purging the wasteland and trying to restore the old order, because I think the various philosophical and economical principles that were present in the old world weren't really ready for something like ghouls and super mutants and basically a labor force that is immortal and can do an extremely huge amount of work. Essentially, they can work in extremely dangerous situations and places that a regular human wouldn't be able to work in. So obviously, nuclear reactors. God knows, like for example, the Chernobyl disaster would have gone very differently if we had a whole bunch of ghouls there. So which could actually fix the entire settlement. So on one hand, it's sort of interesting to look at the Enclave from the perspective of them being the bad guys. However, I think that's been done to death. So in this series, we'll be trying to actually implement some of their logical conclusions when it comes to their practices and their philosophy. Trying to explain it maybe a little bit, try to work it into an actual campaign, and just try to behave as an Enclave officer would, because William Purge here was probably indoctrinated quite heavily when it comes to the Enclave, comes to the Enclave philosophy and their way of doing things, as well as their sort of a militarism. And speaking of that, obviously that's going to influence which factions will be trying to eliminate, which factions will be trying to join, and our overall allegiance, let's say. And that's actually quite curious, because when it comes to the relationship between the Enclave and the NCR, it's very strange, because their propaganda is extremely similar, even if you look at the various posters that are basically placed throughout the entirety of New Vegas. You do see that their main goal is to preserve and restore democracy. Now that's also, let's say, the goal of the Enclave. However, the NCR is, by very definition of the Enclave sort of philosophy, an illegal democracy. It's an illegal state, which while adhering to very similar principles to, let's say, pre-war America, it's still an illegal state, because obviously the Enclave believes that the United States still belongs to the United States, and the overall presence of an NCR-like faction very much undermines the sort of potential of a resurrection of America. On the other hand, for example, Caesar's Legion would be very much aligned with Enclave when it comes to their beliefs regarding ghouls, degeneracy in general, and sort of their very conservative nature when it comes to social matters, and potentially even ultimately siding with them wouldn't be too big of a stretch when it comes to their attitudes towards the NCR and towards moral questions and questions of morality. However, the Legion does like to enslave people that aren't necessarily genetically mutilated or genetically sort of undesirable. So that could actually pose a big problem when it comes to the ideological issue that we're going to face here. And they also are, by definition, a group of raiders and group of criminals that just banded together under some sort of strange ideology of collectivism, which that's been fairly nicely explained by Caesar. That's going to be fairly nicely explained by Caesar. And they're more of a collectivist group. Obviously, that's communism, so we're not going to actually deal with that. Even though it's not actually communism, I do believe that someone from the Enclave would treat that as communism. And when it comes to the other factions, we'll have to see how things develop and how we manage to work the Enclave philosophy and their way of thinking into this. However, I do think it's going to be quite interesting. When it comes to the gameplay side of things, I'll be trying, or William Purge here is going to be trying to mostly rely on military grade equipment, not really using any sort of heavily scavenged or heavily sort of modified weaponry that resembles something lowly Wastelander would use, because he's been trained in using high-end, high-tech plasma and laser pistols and guns and rifles and just energy weapons in general. And he's also fairly proficient in military-grade American regular weaponry, so assault rifles and pistols and submachine guns and stuff like that, even heavy machine guns, let's say. So we'll be trying to mostly rely on, firstly, military-grade weaponry, so, you know, something like the Vermin rifle or the, or like a coach gun, I suppose, or the hunting rifle wasn't going to really apply to any of that. So instead of a hunting rifle, you'll be using like a sniper rifle just in general. So that's basically the trade-off. And also mostly preferring American weaponry over like communist weaponry, which that's going to mostly play a role when we actually manage to find a steady supply of something like that, whether from an Enclave source or an NCR source or just a better source in general. However, for now, since he's been just shot twice in the head and woken up in a grave, I doubt that even through all of his, you know, sort of ideological brainwashing, he'd be too angry at using, for example, the Elysium NK, which is, you know, ultimately a communist weapon, however modified with obviously various attachments that make it more militaristic when it comes to the modern age of Fallout. So that's basically the gameplay perspective on that. When it comes to armor, I'd be ripping myself off if I actually didn't try to use mostly Enclave-related armors, so power armor or just regular combat armor related to the Enclave. And that's going to be, I think, quite fitting with the lore. However, if we're actually going to try and infiltrate and potentially destroy the Brotherhood of Steel chapter within the Mojave Wasteland, I think it would be lore unfriendly to just waltz in with a set of Enclave power armor. Though maybe the state of the Enclave has been damaged and tarnished so much that the Brotherhood of Steel actually wouldn't mind us just waltzing in, because they probably think that we're just some scavenger managed to grab some sort of armor left behind by the Enclave, and they won't actually suspect us of being an Enclave member, because, well, the Enclave has been destroyed for quite a few years by this point in the story, so maybe they just think we're some sort of scavenger with maybe an Enclave helmet. However, the Enclave power armor, that's a different story, so we maybe want to hold off on that, and William Purge will try and be careful when using the Enclave power armor or various armors related to the Enclave when dealing with the Brotherhood of Steel and Veronica, obviously. However, with Veronica, it's a very different story, because she's seen quite a lot outside the vault, or the bunker, more rather. So I think she'd be quite okay with us just running around with the Enclave power suit, because she's sort of neutral towards all the factions, even towards Caesar's Legion, if you actually don't try and destroy the Brotherhood of Steel. So she'd be very friendly even. Maybe she's more of a ideologically neutral character in that regard. We'll just see how things go from there. Now, when it comes to the actual gameplay that we are witnessing here, as you can see, the modded effect of the various gangsters and the various criminals here has actually taken effect in Prim itself, because we see that there are various positions of the gangsters or the sort of escaped inmates is actually taking effect, and they've restored the positions of the pre-patch Prim inmates that have been roaming around before essentially. I think the latest patch, maybe that was changed due to the consoles not being able to handle that, but I do remember when I played New Vegas sort of 1.0, or the very first version of New Vegas when it was just released essentially in 2010. I do remember there being a whole lot more than there ultimately is in the final version, which is just 2 inmates roaming around the casino. So that's I think that's quite interesting. I think due to these various changes, mostly changing not just the positions and the number, but also just restoring potential encounters that were previously deleted by Obsidian or Bethesda, either or, not entirely sure. Probably Obsidian actually. Then this campaign could be actually quite interesting, because I myself, as well as William Purge, obviously he doesn't know any locations lore-wise. However, when you actually play New Vegas, you tend to memorize these sort of positions of your potential opponents, and it makes it play through quite easy, even if you're trying to play in a very sort of restrictive manner. And this should change up things quite a bit, as well as just in general trying to play these characters in a very different manner than you would usually play New Vegas, because the easiest way to play New Vegas is to play a more of a speech-related character. You just try to maximize your speech. You try to finish all the Power Ganger quests before you do the Ghost Town gunfight or the Good Springs Run quests. Because it ultimately locks you down one path or the other, and here we basically went with eliminating the Power Gangers from Good Springs right off the get-go. So it does pose a little bit of a different gameplay perspective, because we won't be relying on speech that much, since William Purge is more of a soldier character. We'll be trying to sort of mimic him being more of a fighter than a talker, more of an angry, violent person that tries to follow orders. Not necessarily violent, I suppose, but more of a strict guidelines person than trying to talk his way out of situations, especially with ghouls and super mutants and criminals and stuff like that, or just people that are ideologically opposed. For example, the Khans and stuff like that. I think we'll be taking a much more militaristic and violent approach in those situations, I suppose. However, for the time being, I think the playthrough is going to be very similar, especially in these first parts. Apart from just increased presence of enemies, there isn't anything that's extremely striking as different. Obviously, I'm not really changing any of the quests, not changing any of the lore strictly within the game, not using, for example, Dust, the survival simulator, because that does change the game quite a bit, especially the early game. However, it wouldn't be really possible to roleplay as an Enclave officer there. I suppose it would be, however the gameplay wouldn't be changed at all, because, in Dust you're just trying to survive, and I suppose it doesn't really matter if you're a former Enclave officer or a former just whoever, trying to survive just makes you try to survive. Wouldn't be really able to locate any sort of Enclave chapters within Dust, I suppose. Maybe it would be, but I think it's going to be quite a different story if we ever get to Dust. However, I don't think so, because I don't really necessarily like the survival aspects of Fallout. Much more of a politics and combat guy. I don't really necessarily like these survival aspects. That's why this is played on not on survival mode at all, because while that would make it a little bit more interesting, I think it's a little bit too not necessarily boring, especially in New Vegas. It's more of an annoyance than really anything else. In Fallout 4, I think these survival mechanics are a little bit different. However, I think they're also just a bit of an annoyance and just get in the way. However, Fallout 4, the role-playing potential of that game is very different compared to Fallout New Vegas, and that's why even this series is played out first, and actually, the first game that we're actually going to be trying to roleplay an Enclave character is New Vegas, because of the backstory being so open-ended, or just free to explore what could have been and whatever. So you can make up stories much more easily in Fallout New Vegas compared to Fallout 4, which does have a very strict background. To a certain extent, you can still roleplay in Fallout 4. However, it's very different. It's much more Not necessarily difficult, however the backstories have to be a little bit convenient for your sake. You have to make a very convenient stories and very convenient situations for your character to for it to actually make sense. For example, William Purge here just woke up, doesn't really remember, just has his orders, remembers the brainwashing, remembers that America is the greatest country that ever existed, and that's it. That's all he remembers, and that's all we need really to roleplay in Fallout New Vegas. But in Fallout 4, we really have to make up some complex situations for a character to for it to even make sense, especially when it comes to Sean and stuff like that. So, Fallout New Vegas, just try to get the guy that shot you in the head and various other objectives that you find along the way. So I suppose that's good enough. However, that also affects the way that we'll be playing through the individual quests in general. I'll be trying to approach them in a more straightforward manner, and we'll be seeing that down the line, I think, quite often, where the most convenient answer isn't the one that we'll be going for. That ties into the speech limitation that I put on my character, and also the just the way that he tends to handle situations, especially due to his tendencies towards a more militaristic approach. However, also his tendencies when it comes to the various I suppose ideological blocks that he has, and his beliefs, and obviously the brainwashing and upbringing that he has. So not every situation is going to play out the best for our character. For example, the best approach to, for example, the final mission is obviously just to pick speech 100 and just talk Leggett Lanius out of the entire confrontation, and it basically makes the game incredibly easy to play through if you know what you're doing, you know which skills to pick. However, in this series we're trying to approach more of a combat soldier, more of a special operative approach to the whole thing, and a special operative from the Enclave, obviously more combat related, but I already talk about that quite a bit. So I think you get the picture. I think this sort of introduction through the entire beginning of Fallout New Vegas has been informative enough when it comes to the way that we'll be approaching it. It's really what I was trying to do here in the first video, just trying to explain how this entire series is going to play out and what's the most important factors for approaching a roleplay, light roleplay such as this, where we just try to play as something like an Enclave soldier. And ultimately you do need mods for this to actually work, because, well, you don't necessarily need mods for it to work. You can still roleplay something like this in the base game. However, it makes it much more, I don't know, it's just a little bit stretched when it comes to the various speech checks and the various things like that. Because you can roleplay basically anything, anywhere, using any skill at any point, and just sort of rationalize your way around it, because you already know how the game is going to play out. But when trying to roleplay someone who just woke up in the desert, doesn't really remember, only knows that he has to do a couple of things that he has to do, and has to rely on his training and his tendencies to get him through, I think that's quite a very different way of actually playing New Vegas, because the base game, since it's so old, you've played it to death, you have like 400 hours played on the base game, and all the DLCs and all the famous mods that basically change not much apart from the gameplay and the way you approach gunplay and stuff like that. So yeah, that's posing sort of a lower limitation on yourself like that. I think it's not quite healthy. Maybe it's a little bit frustrating, but I think it's quite enjoyable all the same. Now, with that half an hour introduction out the way right there, I think it's only fair to actually start focusing on what's going on within the game and what's actually going on the screen. So we just finished Prim, just finished clearing all those convicts, and it's time to pick a new sheriff. Now, logically, since we're playing an Enclave character here, within the sphere that's going on here, we would like to pick someone that's most aligned with the Enclave, or most aligned with the democratic leads and the tendencies and stuff like that. Bring back old America, old American justice. Now, one option obviously is the inmate sheriff. However, that's not an option, because he's a criminal, and being a criminal goes against the justice of the United States. So the second option is a robot. However, he's fairly unreliable, and he probably won't be doing as good of a job. The last option is the NCR. which, while they do have their flaws, they're still a democracy, and while an illegal democracy is not quite as good as a regular democracy, obviously would be best for the situation as a good old American Enclave officer. However, we can't be the Sheriff of Prim, which is unfortunate. However, that would limit our gameplay even further. So, there we go. We're going to side with the NCR in this case, and ultimately we'll be doing a whole lot of that. Because, you know, as I said before, the NCR, best bet when it comes to the Enclave, just trying to re-emerge in the dusty wastes of the Mojave Desert. So there we go. We're gonna side with the NCR here, which it's I think the most sensible choice, because obviously they shoot on sight any feral ghouls. Of course, they're opposed to any sort of super mutant presence, and they do have very bad blood with the super mutants present in Jacobstown, and they generally don't like super mutants or genetic defectives. So there we go. While they are corrupt and they don't have very strict guidelines such as the Enclave democratic way, they're still somewhat of a democracy, and it would be much easier to integrate Prim later into the Enclave if they're at least aligned ideologically in a certain fashion. So there we go. I'm gonna go with the NCR, much better choice than any of the others when it comes to the Enclave. I'm sure President Eden would agree, or at least he would be inclined to agree based on this choice. Later on we might be able to purge Prim if any sort of unwanted presence is present there. But for the time being, we'll be dealing with Prim as it is under NCR control. Now, the road to the actual facility, or the sort of base of the NCR up north, is going to be quite a hassle, because we do have to deal with a lot of various opponents on our way there. None of them are actually ideologically aligned with us, so that makes it much easier to just purge our way up north through all the animals, all the bandits, all the Jackal members and stuff like that. Not entirely sure if it's Jackal or Viper gangsters that are present on the outpost right there. However, or the drive-in more rather. However, we're going to be seeing that very shortly. This little standoff right here between the convicts and the gangsters is always quite funny to me. It's such an obviously scripted event if you've seen it at least twice or three times, but it's so funny that the inmates just get blown out of the water, obviously, because they are equipped with very light armor, which does boost guns quite a bit. However, they're only equipped with light weaponry. I suppose they're equipped with pistols, whereas the gangsters, or the criminals, or whatever you want to call them, gang members, are equipped with usually not necessarily assault rifles. I think it depends when you actually come here, but they're equipped much better than the inmates, which makes sense because the inmates would be only equipped with whatever they could actually find on their way out, or possibly within the correctional facility, and the correctional facility isn't actually all that well guarded, even if you look at the equipment that's present within the base. Now, maybe if Obsidian was given more control, there would be more of a presence there. There's probably a mod that fixes that, but well, we may be returning to something like that in a future playthrough. During this one, now the NCR correctional facility in very terrible shape when it comes to their weaponry, mostly using varmint rifles and pistols. Possibly some 10mm, some machine guns, however, not entirely sure. We'll be visiting them in a while when we actually want to eliminate that convict threat from a potential Enclave advance and potential sort of restoration of law within the Mojave Desert. However, these gangsters right here actually had some very good equipment, some nice pistols that are actually military grade, and some shotguns that are military grade, so we'll be using that. Some Remington shotguns never hurt, because, well, they're Remington shotguns. They're actually used by were used. I'm not entirely sure if they're still used by the US Armed Forces, though I do believe that probably some unit somewhere actually still uses them. But I know during the Vietnam War they were used, so that's that. And of course I'm using a variety of weapon mods that actually does bring the Remington within, which is, I think this one specifically is the Weapons of the New Millennia. So that's that. We'll be trying to eliminate them with good old American weaponry. I'm not really sure if you're using all the various, like, you know, raider mods, if they do still spawn in with better weaponry, or this is just a result of the just better weapons being placed around the Mojave in general. However, we're working with what we actually have right now, so there we go. The MP413 Rex. Now that's a doozy. That's actually a Russian weapon, or at least a weapon used by obviously the Russian armed forces. During this in this timeline, the Soviet Union isn't necessarily opposed when it comes. Well, it is obviously still a communist state or a communist country. Communist regime, let's say. However, they're not strictly enemies with the United States, more of a neutral stance. So the MP41 Rex or any sort of Russian weaponry or strictly Russian weaponry isn't actually off the table. If you're using Chinese weaponry, that might as well just throw it in the bin because we're not dealing with that at all. So yeah, that's also why I sort of chose the Elysium AK as opposed to some Chinese assault rifle with any sort of enhancement or red dot sight or anything, because the automatic Kalashnikov obviously is a Russian weapon, Russian origin, and the Soviets are sort of a-okay during this period of time, or just before the bombs fell. They're sort of not strictly friends with the United States, but they're not exactly enemies. There might be some potential to actually work something out, similar to how the Chinese and the Americans ultimately sort of agreed to at least help each other a little bit during the Nixon administration and afterwards. So yeah, Nixon visits China, basically. That's something like that might have actually taken place during this period of time. Maybe Eden visits Moscow, could be coming up very shortly. Actually, the Enclave managed to succeed, which they obviously will. During our playthrough, we'll be establishing a very nice base for the Enclave, or at least that's one of our missions. So hopefully, if these events of William Purge here actually manage to, you know, come out to fruition, and they actually are lore friendly, maybe in like 50 years time, Eden really does visit Moscow and whatever happened to Moscow. So that's basically that. Now, coming up on these mutated animals, the mutated insects, the ants and the scorpions, I think it's fairly safe to say that the Enclave would be very much opposed to their presence within their sphere of influence, or within their sphere of actual domination and control, because while the Death Claws might be used in combat, I do think that they are quite valuable, and since we do not actually have any sort of equipment that would be able to turn these various creatures towards our side during this period of time, I think it's much safer to just eliminate them as a threat and just be done with them, because well, we don't necessarily want any sort of big ants riding on top of vertebrates or anything like that. Now, Nipton is an interesting one, especially when it comes to the relationship between the Enclave and Caesar's Legion. Obviously, we have to take care of these Jackal gang members quite quickly before we do that, and the plasma pistol will be just fine for that, just fine, especially with all the bonuses we get from our starting equipment, or the gear, or essentially the armor that we have. The Enclave experimental armor will be trying to destroy them quite swiftly, and we actually managed to do that. However, Nipton and the Legion itself is going to be quite different. Now, obviously, our little main character here doesn't really understand the Legion all that well, because he's just woken up with 2 bullet holes in the head. Doesn't really know if they're a lawful organization, just trying to murder the various gangsters that we are, the gang members that we, for example, encountered here, as well as the powder gangers, as well as just corruption in general, because we come in, we learned that Nipton was a terribly corrupt town with extremely immoral tendencies. Now, that's an interesting proposal right there, because maybe from a strictly Enclave philosophical point of view, the Legion was just justified in doing this act, justified in just doing whatever was necessary to cleanse this town of its quote-unquote degeneracy, obviously. And that might be an interesting argument for our character at the beginning here, because obviously while the measures that the Enclave takes are not exactly peaceful. They don't crucify people. They might pull off a little bit of an FEV test here and there, but that's basically it. Here we see that the fine fellow here managed to win against the rascal that tried to take his caps away from him, and since he seems to be a fairly healthy, non-radiated individual who just basically defended his Second Amendment rights, and not Second Amendment, but the right to hold property and to do everything like that, and basically just defended his ground, stood his ground against a violent criminal, we'll be leaving him safe and sound. We won't really be doing anything with him because, well, might be a potential Enclave recruit further down the line, who knows. Different story right here. When we come here, we see this person, very happy. He seems to be wearing some sort of powder ganger's armor, and he claims to have won a lottery, and he claims to be also a member of the powder gangers. Even though he's a former one, he still should be eliminated. And there we go, some good old Enclave justice right here, bam, right in the head. Now that's some good of Enclave justice. So there we go. So as I was saying, with the various raider spawns here, one of them is actually right here with Nipton, and we see that the raiders are actually duking it out with the Caesar's Legion members right here, and that actually might be an additional moral quandary that our ideological quandary maybe that our main character has to face here, because obviously we've seen that the legionaries here just took out a whole bunch of fiends, as well as just killed a whole bunch of powder gangers. So maybe they aren't actually all that wrong. Maybe the Caesar's Legion is one of the best choices for our member of the Enclave right here. We don't know. He doesn't know. It seems that he might be inclined to join the Caesar's Legion, or join Caesar's Legion in general. However, it doesn't really match up with what he's trying to do here. However, since they are restoring order in a certain degree, or to a certain extent within the Mojave, it might be interesting to join them later down the line, as well as just trying to maybe align them with the Enclave. That'll be interesting. However, the Enclave isn't really as much of a friendly organization when it comes to raiders, or former just groups that aren't genetically pure. So even though that alliance might be possible, it still would be counterproductive to what we're trying to do here. And we'll just quickly dismantle Boxcar's life here, because he's obviously still a powder ganger, still a criminal, still a wanted criminal, and yeah, there we go. So this little first episode served, I think, as a pretty decent introduction to what we're trying to do here. I won't be really mentioning the various mods and stuff like that later down the line too much, or the backstory too much, because, well, that's what this video was about, just trying to sort of establish what we're trying to do here. And so there we go. Further down the line, obviously, I'll be trying to make some contact with the NCR, trying to do all the various things, trying to keep those mission objectives in mind. I'm going to be referencing those because that's all our character has to go on. Obviously, since he's been just, brought back from the dead, which is the entire point of the first sort of stage of New Vegas. You've been just woken up in a shallow grave with 2 bullet holes in your head and some equipment from the Enclave. You still are indoctrinated as hell. Obviously, those bullet wounds didn't do too much, because, well, maybe our friend here, our main character, was actually wearing the experimental Enclave headgear, and didn't really do too much because of the damage threshold. You never know. However, still, all he has to go on are his orders and his indoctrination and the weaponry that he's fairly proficient at. So that's that. He still has to find some sort of Enclave remnant organization, or any sort of Enclave presence within the Mojave wasteland. Still has to potentially find out any sort of presence of the Brother of Steel, try to infiltrate them, try to disrupt their organization, try and disrupt their means of survival, do anything to them that would be possible and reasonable, and might bring their sort of presence down a notch, might make them a little bit weaker when we actually ultimately make contact with any sort of possible Enclave remnant organization and try to take control of the Mojave, try to eliminate, obviously, any ideologically and the ideological and genetical disfigurements or whatever, any sort of ghouls, super mutants, criminals, stuff like that. Fairly self-evident that that's what we're trying to do here, and essentially any sort of character would be trying to do that if they're trying to play as the Enclave, and obviously find the person that shot us in the head. However, that's not necessarily something that we'll be necessarily focusing on, because yeah, we're just trying to figure out what sort of Enclave presence we might find here, and we did actually see and prim a pretty decent looking robot, didn't we? So yeah, he did seem like an iBot from the Enclave race, so we might be trying to recruit him, and that's going to be probably our first companion of the day. That's also why I've been sort of leveling up repair for this entire first episode, because repair is going to be very important when we try to revive Eevee, not Eevee, but Edie. And yeah, so that's that. It's a fine look at our character, still very Enclave-like, and there we go. So thank you guys for watching, and see you next time.